When a flight attendant dismisses a Black family and kicks them out of first class, she thinks she's putting them in their place. But when the plane lands, she discovers the shocking truth. They own the airline. What happens next will leave her questioning everything. Before we start the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Rebecca Collins had been working as a flight attendant for nearly 15 years. She had seen it all: grumpy passengers, last-minute requests, and delayed flights. She prided herself on keeping her composure no matter how hectic the day got. Her reputation in the airline industry was one of professionalism. Skylux Airlines, where she worked, had built its name on providing an exclusive, high-end flying experience, the kind of service that made you feel like royalty, even in the air. Rebecca was a key part of that experience. She knew exactly how to manage the expectations of the wealthy elite passengers who booked their first-class tickets, treating them like they were the only ones aboard. To Rebecca, this wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle. That evening, as passengers began to board Flight 512 to Paris, Rebecca stood at the front, scanning the crowd with her usual air of authority. Her eyes lingered on each passenger as they approached the gate. She was already thinking about who would need extra attention, who might complain about the food, and who could potentially make her job harder. As she glanced over the crowd, her eyes fell upon a family that caught her attention. James and Camille Johnson, along with their two young children, stood confidently in line. They weren't flashy, but there was something about them that made Rebecca take notice. James wore a simple navy blue suit, and Camille had on a modest yet elegant dress, their children quiet and well-behaved beside them. From their appearance, they seemed like any other family who could afford first-class tickets, yet something about them unsettled Rebecca. As they approached the gate, Rebecca noticed that their boarding passes were first class, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong in the premium section. It wasn't their attire, no, that was perfect. It wasn't even the polite way they addressed her. It was something else, something Rebecca couldn't quite put her finger on. Her instincts kicked in, and as the family reached the front, she asked them to step aside for a moment. "Is there a problem?" James asked, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was already sensing something was off. Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She scanned their tickets again. There was no mistake, but for some reason she felt an unexplainable urge to challenge them. "I'm afraid I'll need to confirm your reservation," she said, even though the system clearly showed their tickets were valid. "There seems to be some confusion," she added, giving a polite but forced smile. James and Camille exchanged a quick glance, but said nothing. They waited, patient but wary, as Rebecca stepped aside to speak with the supervisor. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the tension between them thickened. Passengers behind the family grew impatient, some whispering quietly about the delay. Finally, Rebecca returned, her smile colder than before. "You'll need to follow me," she said, but instead of leading them to the first-class section in the front of the plane, she directed them to the back, near the restrooms, far from the windows with the best views. It was a subtle, calculated move, one designed to send a clear message. Rebecca didn't believe this family was suited for the first-class experience she had worked so hard to curate. James remained silent. Camille held her children's hands, not reacting to the change in seating, though the unease was evident in her eyes. She had seen this kind of treatment before, but tonight it wasn't about making a scene. It was about making it through this flight and getting to Paris. They settled into their seats. The plane began, and the plane climbed into the sky. Rebecca continued her rounds, greeting passengers, offering drinks, and attending to their every need. But something in the back of her mind gnawed at her. There was something about this family, something about their presence that didn't sit right with her. She couldn't quite understand it, but she knew she needed to keep an eye on them. As the flight progressed, Rebecca found herself glancing toward the Johnson family more often than she intended. They were seated quietly, James reading a book, Camille helping one of the children color in a travel activity book. The younger child had fallen asleep, leaning on her mother's arm. There was nothing unusual about them, no loud voices, no unreasonable demands. If anything, they seemed more composed than many of the other first-class passengers Rebecca had served in the past. Yet she couldn't stop the nagging sense of irritation bubbling under the surface. Rebecca returned to the galley where her coworker Melissa was preparing drinks. Melissa was newer to the airline, still learning the ropes, but eager to please. "Everything okay out there?" Melissa asked as she placed a tray of champagne flutes on the counter. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then decided to confide in her. "You saw that family in the last row first class, right?" she asked, lowering her voice. Melissa glanced toward the section and nodded. "Yeah, they seem nice. What about them?" Rebecca leaned in, her tone sharper now. "Doesn't it feel off? I mean, first class isn't cheap, and they're just, well, you know." She didn't finish her sentence, but her implication was clear. Melissa frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. "They have valid tickets, don't they?" she asked cautiously. Rebecca rolled her eyes. "Of course, but that doesn't mean anything these days. People game the system all the time. I've seen it before." Melissa didn't push further, but Rebecca's words hung in the air. Rebecca continued to stew, her agitation growing. She felt justified in her actions earlier at the boarding gate, convinced that her instincts about the family were correct. She started keeping a closer watch on them, looking for any sign of behavior that might confirm her suspicions. Meanwhile, James and Camille could sense the subtle tension around them. Camille, ever perceptive, noticed that their service was unusually slow. Other passengers had received their drinks and snacks promptly, but their row seemed to be overlooked. When they pressed the call button to request water for their daughter, it took an unusually long time for a flight attendant to respond. Camille said nothing, but James leaned closer to her, whispering, "They're watching us." Camille gave a small nod, her expression calm. "Let them," she whispered back. "We've dealt with worse." James sighed but didn't reply. Instead, he reached for his phone, checking his email briefly before setting it aside. He didn't want to make a scene, but he couldn't help but feel a growing frustration with the way they were being treated. This was supposed to be a relaxing, celebratory trip for their family, not an exercise in patience. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, one of the other passengers in first class was observing her behavior closely. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit, seated a few rows ahead of the Johnsons, had noticed the delays in their service and the barely concealed annoyance in Rebecca's demeanor whenever she passed their row. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing for now. As the flight continued, the tension in the air grew thicker. Rebecca tried to refocus on her duties, moving quickly between the rows, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man's pointed comment and the Johnson family's unwavering composure. Every interaction with them, no matter how routine, seemed to unsettle her more. They weren't confrontational, but their silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, James exchanged a glance with Camille, silently acknowledging the growing unease in the cabin. Camille, ever the steadying presence, leaned in and whispered, "We've handled worse, remember? Let's just enjoy what we can." Her hand lightly brushed his arm, a small gesture of reassurance. James nodded, but his jaw remained tight. Rebecca, standing near the galley, overheard snippets of the passengers' murmurs, though no one openly criticized her. The man's earlier comment had clearly sparked quiet conversations. Rebecca felt her control slipping, and with it came an uncharacteristic nervousness. She prided herself on maintaining professionalism and command in any situation. Why was this family getting under her skin? As the hours stretched on, the cabin lights dimmed for the night. Passengers began settling into their seats, some dozing off while others watched in-flight movies. The Johnson children had fallen asleep, their small heads resting on their parents' arms. James and Camille, however, remained alert, their quiet conversation punctuated by occasional glances toward the flight attendants in the galley. Rebecca couldn't keep her frustrations bottled up any longer. She turned to Melissa and muttered, "I don't understand why they're acting so entitled. It's not like they're royalty." Her voice was low, but the bitterness was unmistakable. Melissa, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated before replying. "I don't think they're acting entitled," she said carefully. "They're just normal passengers. Maybe we should just treat them like everyone else." Rebecca shot her a sharp look. "You don't understand. I've been in this business long enough to know when something doesn't feel right." She didn't explain any further, but the words hung in the air. Melissa opened her mouth to respond, but thought better of it, retreating back to the cabin instead. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, James had quietly risen from his seat and made his way to the front of the plane, speaking briefly with the captain's assistant. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but there was a quiet intensity in his request. The assistant nodded and escorted James to the cockpit, where he had a brief and private conversation. When James returned to his seat, Camille raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. She trusted her husband's judgment and knew that whatever he had planned would be handled with the same quiet dignity they had shown all evening. Rebecca, still oblivious to the conversation in the cockpit, continued her rounds. The other passengers in first class appeared relaxed, but there was a growing sense of awareness among them. Some were beginning to notice the subtle dynamics at play, the way Rebecca seemed to bristle whenever she approached the Johnsons. Whispers grew louder, though no one openly criticized her. As the plane sailed through the darkened night, the cracks in Rebecca's carefully maintained facade began to show. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had. Rebecca's unease continued to grow. Every glance at the John family seemed to unsettle her further. They weren't loud, they didn't demand anything, and yet their quiet presence felt like a challenge she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the cabin remained calm, most passengers either sleeping or quietly watching movies. It should have been a routine flight, but Rebecca could feel an invisible weight pressing down on her. In the first-class cabin, James adjusted his seat slightly, leaning closer to Camille. "Everything set?" he whispered. Camille looked at him, her expression unreadable, before giving him a small nod. She glanced at their children, still fast asleep, then back at her husband. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked softly. James gave a faint smile, the kind that carried both reassurance and resolve. "It's not about us anymore," he said. "It's about everyone who might go through this." Camille held his gaze for a moment before leaning back into her seat, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's. Meanwhile, in the galley, Rebecca found herself unable to shake a nagging sense of something she couldn't quite name. She had always trusted her instincts, and tonight was no different. But instead of clarity, her thoughts were clouded by frustration and confusion. Why did this family, who had done nothing outwardly wrong, bother her so much? She convinced herself it was simply because they were challenging her authority in subtle ways. The man's calmness, the woman's quiet grace, it all felt like an affront, though she couldn't explain why. As Rebecca filled out a routine report near the galley, the same passenger in the sharp suit, the one who had confronted her earlier, approached her. He held his glass of whiskey loosely in his hand, his expression sharp but calm. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping passengers. Rebecca looked up, already bracing her for another comment. "Yes, sir. Is there something I can assist you with?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You've worked for Skylux a long time, haven't you?" "Yes, I have," Rebecca replied, keeping her tone professional but curt. 15 years. Why do you ask?" The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive," he said. "Then you must know how important customer experience is to this airline. I assume the Johnson family in the back row paid the same premium price as the rest of us. Wouldn't you agree they deserve the same service?" Rebecca's mouth tightened. She hated the way his words cut straight to the point. "Of course, sir," she said, forcing a polite tone. "All passengers are treated with equal care." "Are they?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because it doesn't look that way from where I'm sitting." Rebecca's hand clenched slightly around the edge of her clipboard. "But if there's a concern, I assure you it will be addressed." The man took a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving hers. "Good," he said evenly, "because you never know who might be watching." With that, he turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Rebecca standing in the galley with a growing sense of dread. She felt as though she had just been warned, though she couldn't say why. Her thoughts raced, trying to piece together what he might have meant. Did he know the family? Were they someone important? Rebecca shook her head, trying to push the doubts aside. She had handled difficult passengers before, and she would handle this situation as well. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. Something about this flight was different, and she was starting to realize that she might not be the one in control after all. The hours dragged on, and Rebecca's nerves began to fray. Every time she looked at the Johnson family, they seemed so calm, so unbothered by the thinly veiled hostility she had shown them. Their composure only added to her unease, making her feel as if they knew something she didn't. Her mind replayed the man's cryptic remark in the galley. You never know who might be watching. What had he meant, and why had he directed that comment toward her? As the plane began its gradual descent toward Paris, Rebecca tried to focus on the tasks at hand, collecting trash, assisting passengers, preparing for landing, and ensuring the cabin was secure. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her gaze kept drifting to the last row of first class. James and Camille had awakened their children, who were now quietly staring out the window, captivated by the city lights far below. Camille was adjusting her daughter's blanket, while James checked something on his phone, his expression as calm and measured as ever. In the back of her mind, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. It wasn't just the Johnsons' quiet presence, it was the way some of the other passengers had started glancing their way, whispering amongst themselves. The tension in the air had shifted, and Rebecca felt as though she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't control. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the passengers in first class began gathering their belongings, readying themselves to disembark. Rebecca noticed James slip his phone into his pocket before exchanging a quick glance with Camille. The look between them was subtle but deliberate, as if they had silently agreed on their next steps. Rebecca busied herself, ensuring that the other passengers were ready to leave, but her ears remained attuned to any sign of movement from the Johnson family. Finally, the moment came. As the cabin doors opened, Rebecca moved toward the exit to bid farewell to the first-class passengers, her professional smile firmly in place. The passengers began filing out, thanking her and the rest of the crew for their service. The man in the sharp suit passed by her, giving her a long, pointed look, but saying nothing. When it was the Johnson family's turn, Rebecca stiffened slightly. James paused, looking her directly in the eye. "Thank you for the flight," he said, in a tone so polite and measured that Rebecca's stomach tightened. Camille offered a similar courteous nod, her gaze steady and unreadable. Rebecca forced a smile and nodded back. "You're welcome," she said quickly, eager for them to move on. As they exited, James turned briefly to look back at the cabin, his expression thoughtful. Rebecca couldn't tell if it was a gesture of farewell or something else entirely. It left her feeling strangely exposed, as though the thin layer of control she had tried to maintain throughout the flight had been quietly stripped away. Moments after the last first-class passenger left, one of the flight attendants approached Rebecca with a puzzled expression. "The captain wants to see you in the cockpit," she said, her voice hushed. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "Now what for?" she asked, trying to sound composed. "I don't know," the attendant replied, shrugging, "but he said it was urgent." Rebecca felt a jolt of panic, but quickly smoothed her expression. She adjusted her uniform, took a deep breath, and headed toward the cockpit. She told herself it was probably a routine matter, something minor that could be resolved quickly, but as she walked through the empty first-class cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was about the Johnson family, and that whatever was waiting for her in the cockpit would change everything. Rebecca stepped into the cockpit, the usual hum of the plane's systems filling the small, confined space. The captain, a composed and seasoned man named Captain Harris, was seated with the co-pilot beside him, both reviewing final landing procedures. As Rebecca entered, Captain Harris looked up, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Rebecca asked, keeping her voice steady. She clasped her hands in front of her, attempting to maintain her usual professionalism. Captain Harris nodded toward the empty jump seat. "Take a seat, Rebecca." Her heart thudded as she sat, glancing nervously between the men. "Is something wrong?" The captain exhaled deeply, folding his hands on the console in front of him. "Rebecca, we've received a message from corporate," he began, his voice calm but firm. "It concerns the passengers in row 1G and 1H. Rebecca's stomach dropped. She didn't respond immediately, her mind racing. What message? Why now? She had handled the situation discreetly, or so she thought. "The Johnson family," Captain Harris clarified, watching her reaction. "They're not just passengers, Rebecca. They're owners." Rebecca blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. "Owners?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Harris said, his tone sharpening, slightly. "James and Camille Johnson are the majority stakeholders in Skylux Airlines. They recently acquired the company as part of their broader investment portfolio. This flight was one of their first incognito evaluations of staff performance, and from the reports I've been receiving, their experience wasn't exactly up to standard." Rebecca's breath caught, her thoughts spiraled as the weight of his words hit her. owners, the very family she had subtly discriminated against throughout the flight, didn't just buy tickets, they owned the airline. A cold sweat broke on her brow as she pieced together the implications of her actions. Every delay, every slight, every dismissive glance, it had all been noticed, not just by the Johnsons, but likely by the other passengers as well. "Captain," Rebecca started, her voice shaky, "I wasn't aware." "That's the problem," Harris interrupted, his tone cutting. "You weren't aware because you didn't bother to treat them with the same respect you showed other passengers. And now I'm afraid this situation is out of my hands."